We've already discussed how the United States remained neutral throughout the 1930s, but we also mentioned how during the early 1940s, the United States began to support the Allied powers through things like the Lend-Lease Act. This presentation will discuss how the United States got involved in the war and helped win it. Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese send a squadron of planes to attack the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Their goal is to cripple the Pacific Naval Fleet, and it works early on, but the United States enters the war, rebuilds its Pacific Fleet, and eventually wins the war. It's important to remember why Japan is making a move like this. The United States had not only cut off war supplies, but all supplies to the warring nations of Germany, Italy, and Japan. This included oil. And the Japanese war machine was entirely dependent on shipments of oil from the United States. So the goal at Pearl Harbor is really to either scare the United States into reopening trade with them, or to outright defeat the United States. Neither works. Once the war begins, the United States shifts its entire focus onto winning the war. Part of that is to ramp up factory production to produce planes, tanks, aircraft carriers, etc. Women needed to work in factories to replace men who had joined the armed forces and gone off to war. This painting on the right is the very famous image of Rosie the Riveter. War bonds. Throughout the war, funding was achieved through war bonds. It was considered a patriotic act to invest in the war. And you can see on these posters from the period that the buying of war bonds not only showed that you were supporting troops, as seen on the left, you were also helping care for troops, as seen on the right, and you were protecting your children from possible Nazi threat to even the United States over time, as seen in the center. Rationing was a huge part of the war effort. To ensure that troops had enough supplies and food, civilians in the United States had to ration goods. And this photograph is an image of one of the famous war ration books. After a few years of very brutal back-and-forth fighting in North Africa against the Nazis, in the Pacific against the Japanese, the Allies are looking to really gain an advantage. And they look to do so on D-Day, June 6, 1944. An intelligence effort was leading Hitler to believe that the Allies were going to cross from Britain into France across the English Channel at the shortest point, which would have been at a town in France called Calais, which was much further northeast from where the actual invasion in Normandy happened. When D-Day was underway, Hitler was in fact convinced that the Allied invasion of Normandy was nothing more than a distraction from where the real invasion would come at Calais. So there were many, many German panzer tank divisions out in the depths of France in these areas here that he did not deploy to the beaches of Normandy because he was convinced that he was going to have to quickly deploy them up to the Calais area in order to stop the real invasion. This proved to be a fatal error for the Nazis. D-Day helped turn the tide in Europe, but there was still a war to be won in the Pacific. And the U.S. strategy of island hopping was used to go from one area of the Pacific to another, securing island by island one at a time. This famous photograph is of the flag raising at Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific theater of World War II. This is actually a staged photograph because the photographer had missed the original flag raising and wanted to get a good picture, so they staged a second flag raising to get this photograph. This image was turned into a monument in Washington, D.C. that is now the Marine Corps Memorial. Even after Germany had surrendered, Japan was continuing to fight. Little did anyone know, including U.S. citizens, that the United States had developed the atomic bomb throughout the fighting of the war. Harry Truman, president after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, warned Japan that he had a weapon of mass destruction that he would not hesitate to use against them if they didn't surrender. When they didn't surrender, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and you can see Hiroshima after the nuclear blast in this photograph on the left. Japan still didn't surrender, and Truman ordered for another atomic bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki, and you can see the mushroom cloud of that blast in the photograph on the right. The dropping of these two bombs did bring the war to a swift end, although there is controversy even through today as to whether this was the right decision or not. Truman decided that it was worth saving the lives of American soldiers to drop the atomic bomb rather than invade the mainland of Japan with troops, which probably would have been very costly. The consequences of the war. At the end of the war, U.S. and Russian troops were liberating concentration camps all over Europe. Horrific images of the Holocaust can be seen here. The gates to Auschwitz and many other concentration camps would have the words, "Work makes you free." But you can see that work was not the goal. The mass murder of Jews was the goal. You can see in the upper left, malnourished prisoners. The bottom right, a pile of bodies after these malnourished prisoners passed away. And the famous photo seen in the bottom left includes famous author Elie Wiesel, who is the author of Night, a book about the Holocaust. He can be seen here. After the winning of the war, the Allied powers held trials led by the United States to put Nazi war criminals on trial. These trials were held in Nuremberg, Germany, and become known as the Nuremberg Trials. You will likely be asked about the Nuremberg trials in response to the Nazi Holocaust. At home in the United States, a Supreme Court decision, Korematsu v. U.S., addresses the issue of Japanese internment camps. Korematsu, a U.S. citizen, was suing the government saying that they were not providing him with his due process rights. However, the Supreme Court decision said that because Korematsu, who was of Japanese ancestry, was a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States, that Japanese internment camps were perfectly acceptable. It isn't until many, many years later that formal government apologies were issued for Japanese internment camps. This case should sound very familiar to Schenck v. U.S. during World War I. Charles Schenck was encouraging people to dodge the draft and avoid joining the military during the war. He was jailed, and when he sued the government, the same justification that is used here against Korematsu was used against Schenck. The claim was that Schenck presented a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States. If an essay was to pop up on the Regents exam about Supreme Court cases, Schenck and Korematsu were two very good choices to discuss together in the same essay. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back and take the online quiz associated with these notes. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.